SHHH, settle in, let the day slip away. You've found your way to a quieter place tonight. A candle-lit corridor in time, where the noise of the present fades and history whispers instead of shouts. This evening, we won't march through battles or pace the cold stone walls of a forgotten castle. No, tonight we're invited to something far more delicate, something laced in lace, sealed with solemn vows, and wrapped in ribbons of ritual. Tonight we're going to a wedding, not just any wedding, a medieval wedding, a union not just of hearts, but of land, loyalty, and legacy. Imagine the scent of rosewater and open fire, the weight of wool and velvet, the murmurs of guests in a church lit only by flickering candles, the creak of wooden benches, the rustle of linen veils. But don't worry, there's no need to rise or toast or dance. You're just a guest in the shadows, watching, listening, floating gently through time as we explore how love, power, and tradition entwined in the medieval world. So lay back, let your mind wander, let the ancient bells begin to ring softly in the distance, because this is a deep dive into medieval weddings, and we are only just beginning the medieval meaning of marriage. SHH. Let us drift gently backward now. Let the night hold you still. You needn't move, you needn't think too much. Only breathe and listen and feel the centuries melt away like candle wax in a slow flame. We're leaving behind the now. No emails, no errands, no alarms. Just hush and history. Imagine a world where marriage is not an act of passion, but of preservation. A tool, a tether, a transaction. In the medieval world, marriage was not the romantic covenant we tend to envision today. It was not always about love, though love sometimes came. It was not necessarily about choice, though choice was sometimes involved. It was about land, power, inheritance, survival. It was a bond not merely between two people, but between families, fortunes, fates. And that, in itself, is where we begin. Gently, delicately. Imagine a chilly English dawn in the year 1180. A slight fog clings to the hedgerows. The air smells of damp earth and chimney smoke. In a manor house tucked between rolling hills, a father stirs at the edge of a long oaken table. He's not thinking about his daughter's favorite flowers or her dreams of a white gown. He's thinking about the borders of the estate. He's thinking about lineage, about who can expand the family holdings, about the tax burdens and obligations owed to the crown. His daughter, no older than 13, waits quietly in the corner, her hands folded, her eyes lowered. She already knows the outcome. A husband has been chosen, a marriage arranged. To our modern ears, it may sound strange, even cruel. But in the medieval world, marriage was a contract, a deeply serious one. A holy sacrament, yes, but also a binding social and economic agreement. And this agreement was necessary. Life was short, inheritance was everything, and dynasties, whether noble or peasant, depended on carefully selected unions. In noble houses, especially, marriage was rarely about affection. Kings gave daughters like chess pieces to secure treaties. Barons married off sons to claim bloodlines, wealth, or even a distant claim to a throne. One might be born the child of a knight and become, through marriage, the mother of a future duke. A well-made marriage could lift generations. A poor one could doom them. But even among the peasantry, where titles were absent and property was modest, the meaning of marriage was still layered. The village farmer needed help in the fields. A daughter might bring a small dowry of sheep, or a spinning wheel. A son might gain a strong-bodied wife to help with harvests. They may have chosen each other at the village well or the May Day dance, but the bond they entered was practical too. They needed each other. They needed a partner in labor, in childbirth, in hardship, in hunger. Now close your eyes a little more. You're drifting through a hall where two families meet. There's bread on the table, a pitcher of mead. Documents are being read aloud, in Latin perhaps, no rings yet. No walk down an aisle, just negotiations. The union is being crafted like a legal arrangement, because that's what it is. And yet, it's not entirely cold. There were cases, especially among free peasants or tradespeople in towns, where affection bloomed. Two people might meet at the market, share stolen glances, exchange small gifts. They might whisper behind hay carts or walk a little too long after church. Their parents might approve or not, but there were always stories of runaway lovers, defiant brides, and quiet resistance. But still, even love had to submit to the rule of the church. Marriage was considered one of the 7 sacraments by the Catholic Church, and its spiritual meaning shaped its structure profoundly. It wasn't just a legal matter, it was a divine one, a bond blessed by God, one that ideally could not be broken. To marry outside the church's approval was risky. You could be deemed illicit, your children illegitimate. Your lands, if you had them, could fall into dispute. So even when a couple was deeply in love, they often needed permission, sometimes from their Lord, always from the church. Consent was key, but that word meant something different then. A bride had to say yes, or at least not say no. But silence could be interpreted as assent. If two people said, in front of witnesses, that they accepted each other as husband and wife, sometimes even without a priest, that could be considered a valid marriage under church law. That's how powerful the words were. Speak them once, and your fate could be sealed for life. But consent was only the beginning. The church expected marriages to be open, honest, and lifelong. Divorce in the modern sense was nearly impossible. Only an annulment could dissolve a marriage, and that required proving it was never valid to begin with, perhaps due to consanguinity, coercion, or a failure to consummate. It was a rare and difficult process, and consummation mattered deeply. In fact, a marriage might be considered invalid if it was not physically completed. This detail, often whispered about today, was of public concern then. Some communities even observed or symbolically celebrated the couple's first night together with bizarre and invasive customs. But we'll speak softly of that later. For now, return to that quiet village. There is a boy barely 16, being coached by his father on what to say. There is a girl, her hair braided with a single ribbon, standing beside her mother. Their futures are about to be bound, perhaps forever. They may not yet understand what that means, but their parents do. Their priest does. The land they stand on knows it, too, because marriage in the medieval world was the root of lineage. It was the system by which families reproduced not just bodies, but identities. Family names, coats of arms, legal rights. It was how power moved from one generation to the next. It was how the dead lived on, through heirs. That is why marriage was taken so seriously, why the church codified it, why noblewomen were married off at 12, and kings took wives for political advantage, and peasants whispered vows behind barns, but still prayed for God's blessing. Marriage held society together. It told people who they were, what they were owed, what they were expected to give. There was no registry, no diamond rings, no honeymoon, but the weight of the promise that was heavier than gold. And with that promise came expectation, for the bride to bear children, especially sons, for the groom to provide, to protect, to farm, or to fight, or to rule, depending on his station. Gender roles were tightly drawn, and marriage was the framework that enforced them. A woman passed from her father's control to her husband's. A man gained both a partner and a subordinate. The law, religion, and culture all reinforced this hierarchy. Yet within it there was complexity. There were husbands who adored their wives, wives who ruled the household with grace and intelligence, partnerships that bloomed with mutual respect, even affection. Letters survive, love letters, even from medieval couples who clearly cherished each other. Poets wrote of longing, ballads were sung of lovers separated by war or death. Affection found its way through the cracks of structure. It always does. Still, the framework remained the structure, the expectation, and so marriage in the Middle Ages was not a simple thing. It was not a single event, but a slow unfolding, a family discussion, a legal decision, a religious ceremony, a community witness, a shared bed, a new chapter in a long story. It was both deeply personal and profoundly public. And as you drift further now into the gentle edges of sleep, imagine yourself standing at the edge of such a moment, not as a bride or groom, but as a quiet observer, a shadow by the doorway, watching. There is music, soft and lilted. Not orchestras, but fiddles, reeds, the tap of foot on packed earth, the scent of herbs strung in garlands, the rustle of linen, the murmur of prayer. A young couple joins hands. They are nervous. Their futures are unknown, but the ritual wraps around them like a warm cloak. They are not alone. They are part of something older than their names, older than their breath. This is the medieval meaning of marriage. Not just love, not just duty, but lineage, faith, continuity, a contract made holy. And so, as your eyes grow heavier, and the sounds of that ancient hall fade into the soft dark, let this thought drift with you into slumber, that even in a time of rigid custom and quiet obedience, people still hoped, still dreamed, still longed for someone to stand beside them as the world turned onward. May your sleep be as gentle as their vows, and your dreams as lasting as the promises they made by candlelight. Courtship and betrothal, the slow dance of permission, property, and promises, sleep, comes easier when the mind is somewhere else. Somewhere slower, quieter, older. So allow yours to wander again, not forward, but back. Back to a world where falling in love wasn't a private affair of poetry and glances, but a public negotiation. A dance done not between just two hearts, but between whole families, whole communities, even kingdoms. And so we enter the hush of medieval courtship. Now, don't be fooled by the word courtship. The medieval version bore little resemblance to the candlelit dinners or tender texting of our modern world. It was a slow and careful dance, a dance where every step had consequences. One wrong move could cost a dowry, or a title, or the delicate thread of an alliance woven between two great houses. Still, even within these rigid customs, courtship had its moments of sweetness, of hope, and sometimes, just sometimes, of love. Picture, if you will, a market day in a small village in 13th century Normandy. The streets are narrow, the stalls bustling with dried herbs, fresh apples, cured fish. Somewhere near a tanner's shop, a boy glances up from carrying a bucket and catches eyes with the baker's daughter. She looks away quickly, cheeks pink. They know each other by name, perhaps, or not at all. Maybe they've only seen each other at Sunday Mass. But the thought, the flutter, it begins. Yet before anything can blossom, there are rules, so many rules. In the medieval world, courtship wasn't about spontaneity, it was about structure. A young man couldn't simply ask for a lady's hand. Not even among the peasantry. First came permission, often a conversation quiet, formal, and strategic between fathers. Or between a suitor and the lord of the manor, depending on status. Sometimes a mother might weigh in, often with sharp judgment, measuring the girl's worth in linen, labor, or lineage. And if the maiden was noble, then things were even more delicate. Courtship among the aristocracy was more like a game of chess than romance. Families would send envoys, letters would be exchanged, details negotiated. Age, family history, property, religious alignment, political ties, every detail mattered. Was the girl of childbearing age? Was the boy likely to inherit land? Did either family owe debts or seek favor from a higher noble? In short, was this match beneficial? But beneath the practicality, there was always the possibility of affection. Not passion, perhaps, not the kind of heady, storybook love we read about today, but warmth, admiration, and in some cases, a quiet, patient longing. There were, of course, rules about age. In canon law, a girl could be betrothed at age 7 and married by 12, while boys were often considered ready by 14. It's a detail that feels jarring to us now, but in a world where life expectancy was short and political timelines were swift, childhood often ended early. Still, it's important to know that a betrothal did not always mean immediate marriage. It was a promise. Awaiting, this brings us to the betrothal itself. Imagine a winter afternoon, snow thick outside the stone walls of a manor. Two families gather around a wooden table. There is bread, salt, perhaps a goblet of warm wine. The girl, perhaps 13, perhaps 16, stands beside her father, her hands folded beneath a veil. The boy is older, nervous, dressed in his best tunic. There is parchment involved, a scribe if the families are wealthy enough. Latin phrases are spoken sponsalia per verbo de futuro, a promise for the future. This is the betrothal. Not a wedding, but something nearly as serious. Unlike modern engagements, a medieval betrothal carried spiritual and social weight. It could not be broken easily. In some cases, it was considered just as binding as the marriage itself. Breaking it without cause could lead to scandal, legal trouble, even excommunication from the church. To finalize the betrothal, the couple would exchange words. Often, they would repeat a vow in front of witnesses. Something simple, I promise to marry you and none other. In some traditions a ring was given, or a token, perhaps a brooch or a belt. The families might sign a written agreement, detailing the dowry, the bride's portion, the wedding date to come. Then there would be a meal, a small celebration, a prayer, and then they would wait. Sometimes the waiting lasted weeks, sometimes years, especially if the bride was very young. During this time, the couple might meet occasionally, at festivals, at church, under watchful eyes. They might write to each other, though literacy was rare. Gifts might be exchanged, a carved wooden comb, a length of ribbon, a bit of lace tucked secretly into a shoe. They were not yet married, but they belonged to one another, in the eyes of the church, in the eyes of their village. In the eyes of fate, and sometimes things went wrong. A betrothed couple might grow apart. Perhaps the young man sought another match, richer or closer. Perhaps the girl fell ill. Or perhaps more scandalously another suitor caught her eye and she him. In such cases, families would call in clergy or legal aid. Promises had to be undone carefully, if at all. But more often things moved forward. As the wedding approached, preparations would begin. The bride's family might start collecting household goods for her dowry blank, its cooking pots, livestock if they had it. The groom's family might work on expanding a home or planting crops to support a new household. Elders would advise the couple on marriage duties. Clergy would remind them of their spiritual responsibilities, and still they would wait. Let us now step softly into a village green, where May Day is being celebrated. Garlands of wildflowers hang from every doorway. Young people gather, dancing in slow circles, weaving ribbons around a pole. This, too, was courtship, a gentle, festive way for potential matches to meet. Many betrothals began in the spring, when life bloomed and futures felt pliable. Among the upper classes, courtly love played its own role, especially in the high medieval period. Troubadours sang of longing nights and unattainable ladies. Lords wrote verses from the battlefield, dreaming of fair maidens who wore their colors. But even this, romantic as it sounds, was often more performance than possibility. Courtly love was ritualized affection, sometimes chaste, sometimes not, but rarely meant for actual marriage. Still, it speaks to a desire always present, the desire to be chosen, to be wanted. Even in a world bound tightly by rules and arrangements, people longed for recognition, connection, even if only through a poem passed under the table. There were games, too, subtle customs that signaled interest. A glance held too long, a token dropped accidentally, for someone to return. Girls might weave charms or whisper to the moon for a good husband. Boys might ask for a ribbon from a maiden before going to war. It wasn't just business. There was tenderness in the margins. And then, of course, there were the exceptions. There were elopements, secret marriages, lovers who ran away under cover of night to speak their vows in a grove or before a sympathetic priest. The church frowned upon such unions, but not always with success. If the words were said freely and in front of witnesses, the couple might still be deemed married, even without formal ceremony. That was the power of consent, and it terrified families who sought control. But for most, courtship was a communal act. It involved parents, priests, neighbors. It was slow, careful, and often as much about survival as it was about sentiment. And still, somehow, people fell in love, among farmers and shepherds, among stonemasons and brewers, among the middling classes rising in the towns. Two people could meet, make promises, and build a life from the ground up. Their hands would blister, their children would cry, but their vows, spoken during courtship and confirmed in marriage, would hold. And now, as you lie still and warm, imagine you are walking through the corridors of memory, not your own, but humanity's. Imagine 1,000 hands clasping, 1,000 promises whispered beneath breath. Imagine a girl weaving a garland and thinking of the boy who passed her a carved button weeks before. Imagine her wondering if he'll speak to her father, if her father will say yes, if she'll leave home soon for another village, for a new life. This was the slow music of courtship. No sudden dances, no flash proposals, just long conversations. Quiet arrangements, the gathering of wool and whispers, the waiting, the wondering. And when the time came, when the betrothal was sealed and the wedding day named, the village would hold its breath, if only for a moment, because a new household was about to be born, and that meant hope, continuity, a little more life added to the fabric of the world. Sleep now, if you haven't already. Let the threads of history rock you gently. They're old and soft, worn smooth by centuries. Courtship was never just about romance. It was about connection, about preparing the ground where love, or at least companionship, could grow. And in the flickering candlelight of the medieval world, that hope was enough. Child marriages and political matches, when tiny hands sealed royal fates. Let's slip a little deeper into history tonight. Just a little further down the corridor, where the candlelight grows dim and the air tastes of parchment, beeswax, and secrets. Here time slows again, this time in hushed palace halls, echoing with the footsteps of tiny shoes. We are not just in the village now, not just among the shepherds or blacksmiths or brewers. No, tonight we're wandering through the towering stone castles of Europe, where power was spun like thread and sealed with rings too large for the fingers they adorned. This is where the children were married. It may sound unbelievable to us now, to bind children in matrimony, to speak of bridegrooms still learning to read and brides barely taller than a spindle. But in the medieval world, especially among the noble and royal classes, childhood was not always a time of play. It was often a time of preparation, a time of duty, and marriage was destiny. Imagine a girl of 6, her hair combed until it shines, her dress stitched with tiny pearls at the cuffs. She does not yet know the weight of the word bride, but she knows she must curtsy when her father tells her. She knows not to cry, even though her favorite doll has been left behind. She is being sent to a foreign court, far from home, to grow up alongside the boy she will one day marry. This was common practice among the royal houses of medieval Europe. A child betrothed at 4 or 5 might be packed off by 7 or 8 to join her future husband's household. There she would be raised in their customs, trained in their language, observed by their counselors. She would be watched for obedience, for grace, for signs of loyalty. And the boy, too, was expected to grow up knowing that one day this girl, not yet a woman, would be his wife, his consort, the mother of his heirs. But why marry children? Why not wait until they were older? The answer, as so often in history, lies in power. In a world where kingdoms rose and fell by the bloodlines of their rulers, Marriage was not merely a personal affair. It was a political act. It was a treaty, a declaration, a military strategy. If a French princess was promised to an English prince, it meant more than a wedding. It meant peace, or at least the hope of it. If a Spanish noble girl was married into the Habsburg line, it meant influence, allegiance, perhaps even claims to distant thrones. And the earlier the promise was made, the harder it was to break. A child betrothal was like planting a flag, staking a claim before another kingdom could. If you waited too long, your rivals might scoop up the best matches. So families acted swiftly, binding their children together in name and vow, often before those children even knew how to write their own. Take, for example, Margaret Beaufort, a name whispered through the quiet corners of English history. She was married formally, at just 12 years old, to Edmund Tudor, a man 10 years her senior. By 13, she was a widow. By 13, she was also a mother, giving birth to the boy who would one day become Henry Roman VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. A girl not yet grown, pressed into motherhood, wrapped in politics and pain. She was not the only one. Blanche of Castile was betrothed at 12, married shortly after, and crowned Queen of France before her 15th birthday. Isabella of Valois, just 6 years old, was married to Richard Roman II of England. The marriage was never consummated, of course, but it still bore the weight of diplomacy. The sight of a king, aged nearly 30, placing a ring on the finger of a child. It sounds ghastly now, but to the onlookers of the time, it was a symbol of peace between warring nations, a living treaty dressed in silk and innocence. Of course, not all child marriages were consummated immediately. In many cases, the physical union was delayed until the bride reached what the church called the age of consent, generally 12 for girls and 14 for boys. Even then, the definition of readiness varied wildly. Sometimes the church intervened, sometimes it did not. Sometimes kings pressed forward, regardless of age or health or fear. But always the expectation loomed. Once married, a bride, regardless of her years, was expected to produce heirs. And that pressure was enormous. Royal daughters were raised from birth with one purpose: to marry, to bear sons, to secure the line. Their value was tied not to their wit or kindness or dreams, but to their wombs, to the alliances they could forge and the bloodlines they could continue. There is a certain heartbreak in that, isn't there? A little girl, raised among fine tapestries and velvet cloaks, but never told her future was her own, trained to speak gently, to dance modestly, to remain pious and obedient, and then handed off like a parcel in exchange for land or safety or wealth. And the boys, they too bore burdens. Imagine a 12-year-old prince learning statecraft, his tutors reminding him that his bride will be arriving soon, that he must greet her with formality, that her arrival signals a pact, not a playmate, not a friend, but a symbol, a girl he barely knows, whom he must protect, command, and one day rule beside. Sometimes the children became fond of each other, sometimes not. There are records of royal couples who grew up together, betrothed at birth, married by 15, who built something resembling affection. But there are also stories of coldness, of cruelty, of mismatched pairs who loathed one another but were bound until death. There were no annulments for incompatibility, there was no divorce, there was only endurance. And yet, beneath the grandeur, beneath the gold and the trumpets and the prayers, these were still children. Small hands held nervously, quiet tears shed behind carved pillars, eyes wide with fear on the wedding day, when the church doors opened, and the incense was too strong, and the words too big to understand. We know this because some of their voices survive, letters, diaries, fragments of sorrow pressed into parchment, young queens writing home to mothers they miss, child brides begging their husbands for kindness. Or worse, no words at all, just silence, because they were never taught to write, never allowed to speak freely. Let's step quietly now into the court of King John of England, The year is 1200. He has just married Isabella of Angoulême. She is likely no older than 12. She becomes queen instantly. An immense honor, one might think. But she is ripped from her homeland, her previous betrothal broken, and sent to the heart of a kingdom in political unrest. She will have 5 children. She will become a widow. She will marry again. But her childhood, like so many others, ended not with age, but with a wedding vow. Not all child marriages were royal. Among the noble classes, especially those with ambitions, the practice trickled downward. A baron might marry off his daughter to a neighboring lord to expand his lands. A knight might pledge his son to a noble heiress in hopes of wealth. These were not fairy tales. These were strategies, played with real people. Even among peasants, early betrothals were known, though marriages before adolescence were far rarer. Without the same political needs, working-class families tended to marry their children later, often in their late teens or early 20s. Still, even here, alliances mattered. A strong daughter married to the right household could bring security. A son who married into a larger farm might one day inherit more acres. But nowhere was the union of children more visible, or more unsettling, than in the upper echelons of society. The pageantry of royal weddings, the public display of innocence bound in ceremony, created a paradox. To secure the future of a realm, rulers relied on the vulnerability of the very young. And yet these children grew up. Many became rulers in their own right, queens who governed in the absence of kings. Kings who led armies before they could grow full beards. They were shaped, not just by their tutors or crowns, but by the marriages imposed on them, by the strange mix of expectation and control that had followed them since the cradle. And some, remarkably, made the best of it. Some girls, once married, seized power in their own ways through court influence, patronage, diplomacy. Elena of Aquitaine, though not a child bride by medieval standards, was married young and maneuvered through 2 royal marriages to become one of the most powerful women of her time. Others, like Margaret of Anjou or Catherine de Medici, used their roles as queen consorts to navigate the dangerous waters of European politics with startling skill. But many did not. Many faded into footnotes, married young, died young, forgotten young, their names lost, their voices never recorded. And so, as you drift now into the slower rhythm of sleep, let your thoughts settle gently. Let the grandeur fall away, let the coronation robes vanish. All that's left is a child, standing in the echoing quiet of a great stone hall, holding the hand of another child. Not in play, but in duty. They do not understand yet what is expected, but they will, and as history moves around them, banners waving, armies marching, kingdoms rising, they remain still. A symbol, a bond, a promise made too soon. Sleep now, you're safe in the shadow of the past, a quiet guest in the corridors of memory. And the bells, soft and distant, toll not for kings or queens, but for the children behind their thrones. Dowries and daughters, what it cost to give a girl away. SHHH, listen closely now. We're entering another quiet chamber of the past, not one built of stone or guarded by knights. This chamber is softer, quieter. It echoes with hushed conversations and the clink of coin on wood, the shuffle of cloth as hands fold garments into chests, the subtle murmur of women at work, preparing, anticipating. Tonight, we explore the price of a daughter. It's a harsh phrase, isn't it? Almost cruel to modern ears. But in the medieval world, the value of a daughter was often measured in tangible things: coin, cloth, livestock, land. The dowry, a simple word with such heavy weight. Let us begin gently with a small, candlelit room in a manor house. The year is 1273. A girl sits at her mother's feet. She is perhaps 14. Her dress has been lengthened again to fit her growing limbs, but still it clings awkwardly at the wrists. She is quiet, The mother is not. She is counting, not blessings, but linens, dishes, silver spoons. She opens a chest, lifts out folded wool, rubs it between her fingers, then moves to the next. These are the makings of a dowry. The price of letting go, because to give away a daughter was not simple. It was not just a matter of ceremony and vows. It was a transfer, a transaction, and it had to be paid for. The dowry system existed in many forms across the medieval world, but at its core, it was a contribution, something the bride's family gave to the groom, or to the new household, to ease the burden of marriage. It might be money. It might be clothing. It might be land, tools, animals, jewelry, or even books, though books were rare and precious. What mattered most was that something was given. Something was transferred. Something valuable. Why? Because daughters did not stay. Sons remained in the home, often inheriting property, carrying on the family name. Daughters, on the other hand, were expected to leave, to become part of another family, to serve another name. And in doing so, they took with them not just their presence, but their labor, their potential, their wombs. So, the dowry was a kind of compensation, a way of saying, we give you our daughter, and here is something to help with what she brings and what she leaves behind. It wasn't always money, though gold and silver certainly held their place. Among the wealthier classes, dowries were elaborate. A noblewoman might bring with her bolts of fine silk, fur-lined cloaks, golden rings, and embroidered altar cloths. Entire villages might be promised as part of her bride price, tracts of land and tenants bundled into the contract like cattle. In royal marriages, dowries were instruments of diplomacy. Kings used their daughters to secure peace and trade through promises of immense wealth. But even among peasants, the practice held. A farmer's daughter might bring 2 goats, a spinning wheel, and a chest of home-made linen. A cooper's daughter might come with barrels of ale or a sack of grain. These were not trifles, these were survival. And the absence of a dowry, that could be devastating. A girl without a dowry was called dowerless. It was a word that stuck like a thorn. It followed her through the village, through whispered conversations and lowered eyes. Without a dowry, her chances of marrying well, or at all, were severely reduced. There were exceptions, of course. Love sometimes overcame economics, and among the poorest, where nobody had anything to give, marriages still happened. But the lack of a dowry could mean remaining unmarried, dependent, vulnerable. For some girls that meant entering the church. A nun did not require a dowry in the same way, though many convents still expected a financial contribution. It was cheaper, sometimes, to send a daughter to the cloister than to marry her off. Others found work in households as servants or lived with siblings. Some disappeared from the records entirely, and so, for many families, securing a dowry for a daughter was a matter of great importance. Mothers would begin preparing from the time a girl was very small, spinning and weaving fabric, collecting useful items, saving coins in secret. Fathers might strike deals, make trades, pledge timber or grain years in advance. It was a long process, a quiet labor of love and duty. And it wasn't just the material. The dowry also spoke of honor, of reputation. To offer a strong dowry was to declare your family respectable, capable, generous. To receive one was a mark of pride. And for the girl at the center of it all, her dowry was often the single most important factor in determining her future. Not her voice, not her mind, but her portion. There were times when the process became public. In noble houses, the dowry was written into marriage contracts, legal, binding, witnessed affairs. Disputes could arise if items were missing, if promises were broken. There were even dowry courts in some regions where cases were tried like any other breach of agreement. Among the poor, things were simpler, and yet just as binding. A father might shake hands with a neighbor, agreeing that his daughter would marry the neighbor's son in exchange for 6 sheep, delivered by harvest. If the sheep didn't come, no marriage. If the girl ran away with someone else, trouble. And then there was the other side, the dower. Often confused with the dowry, the dower was what the groom promised to the bride in return. A guarantee for her future, especially if he were to die first. In theory, it provided some protection, a bit of land, a portion of his wealth, a roof over her head. But in practice, it wasn't always honored. Widows were vulnerable, especially if there were sons involved or brothers of the deceased, eager to claim what remained. Still, the dower was written, recorded. It was the legal shadow of the emotional bargain made on the wedding day. So now, close your eyes further. Imagine a bride stepping into her new home. She carries not just herself, but her dowry. Behind her trail servants, carts, or perhaps just a single mule laden with goods. A carved chest, a sack of coins hidden under blankets. Maybe a necklace her mother gave her with trembling hands. These are more than possessions. They are symbols of where she came from, of what she brings, of who she now must become. And still, within this economic transaction, there lived moments of tenderness. A mother placing a comb into her daughter's hand, a father counting out coins in private, knowing it will leave the household lean, a brother stitching her initials into a piece of cloth, because dowries were not always cold. They were sometimes love expressed in the only language that could ensure safety. Protection in a harsh world. There were times, too, when dowries became weapons. A noblewoman whose family was disgraced might see her dowry revoked. A suitor might reject a girl if her portion wasn't rich enough. Political marriages might fall through because a chest held too little gold. Entire wars erupted when dowries weren't paid. The Crusader kings of Jerusalem, the dukes of Burgundy, the princes of Spain, they all fought over dowries as much as over thrones. It wasn't just the cost of giving a girl away. It was the cost of giving away power. And for the girl so young, so often silent, what did it mean? It meant that marriage was not escape. It was a transfer from father to husband, from childhood to womanhood, from property to property, but not always without hope. Some women managed their dowries well, used them to create leverage. Some insisted on control of their property, even after marriage. Widows, in particular, could become quite powerful, especially if they retained their dower lands. There were tales of women who ruled estates, sued for their rights, commanded respect. These stories flicker like candles in the dark, small but real. And so now, as the night deepens and your thoughts grow softer, think of those dowry chests, lined with wool, filled with linens folded by moonlight, spoons polished again and again, hope stitched into every hem. Think of the quiet math of mothers, the borrowed coin, the borrowed time, the price not of love but of survival, because in a world where girls had few choices, the dowry was not just a tradition. It was a key, and with that key some found freedom, some found sorrow, and some simply faded. Sleep now, let the numbers fade, let the chests close, let the daughters rest in memory. The cost has been paid, the candle is out, the story for now is done. Hand-fasting rituals tying knots long before the altar. Let your thoughts drift now like threads pulled slowly through time. We are not in a grand cathedral tonight. There are no bells ringing overhead, no altars dripping with incense, no armored knights pacing before tapestries. Not yet. We are far from the castles, far from the noble courts. Tonight we find ourselves in a glade, or perhaps a small village square, where the earth is soft, and the trees lean in like witnesses. The air is sweet with wood smoke and herbs, and there, under a sky that promises nothing but dusk, you'll find two hands being joined. Gently, softly, not by law, nor lord, nor priest, but by thread. This is hand-fasting. Before weddings were crowned by churches, before parchment and priests made things legal and binding, there were cords. There were words. There were two people standing together, eyes on each other, hearts quiet and full. The custom of hand-fasting stretches long into the shadows of the medieval world, particularly among the Celtic peoples, but scattered too in Old Anglo, Saxon and Norse traditions. It wasn't always recognized by the church, nor did it always follow one clear rule. But it had something even older than law. It had meaning. To hand fast meant to bind hands, quite literally. A cord or ribbon, sometimes a belt, sometimes a woven strand of cloth or flax, would be gently wrapped around the couple's hands as they spoke their vows. Sometimes left hand to left hand, sometimes right to right, sometimes both hands together, sometimes only one. The style varied from place to place, from year to year, but the idea was steady: 2 people, 1 thread. One promise: it was an act of union, but also of intention. Sometimes hand-fasting was a precursor to marriage, a sort of engagement, though not in the modern sense. In some places it was called a year and a day union, a trial, a period in which the couple would live together, see if their hearts could settle, see if children would come. If at the end of the year they remained happy, the hand-fasting could become a full marriage, sealed at last before priest and altar. But not always. In more rural communities, especially far from cathedrals and legal courts, hand-fasting was the marriage. No priest required, no witness of parchment or scribe, just 2 people, 2 hands and a cord. It might be overseen by a village elder, a parent, or perhaps by no one at all. In the eyes of the folk, the act itself was sacred. To promise one another with joined hands was enough, and if done before others, it was binding. Of course, the Church frowned upon this. Over time, ecclesiastical law grew stronger, and hand-fasting became suspect. It was too private, too informal, too human. Still it endured through the misty valleys of Scotland, along the coasts of Ireland, and you don't village greens, among those who lived more by the sun and season than by parchment and pen. The ceremony was simple. The couple would stand together, facing one another, often barefoot, often trembling, not always in joy, sometimes in uncertainty. A cord, often red or blue or earth toned, would be brought forward, and the vows would begin. They weren't always spoken aloud in Latin. Sometimes they were quiet murmurs in the common tongue, simple phrases easy to remember. I take thee with my hand, I bind myself to thee, before the earth and sky I am yours. No florid poetry, no grand declarations, just the steady beat of sincerity. In some villages, hand-fasting was held during the festival of Beltane May Day, a time of fertility and spring. There, the fires would blaze, and couples would leap them hand in hand, sealing not just vows, but hopes for children and crops and continuity. But not all hand-fastings were celebrations. Some were hasty, made in times of war, just before a young man marched off in armor. A ribbon tied quickly around their wrists by a tearful mother or sister. Some were solemn, made in the cold light of necessity, when 2 families needed alliance and the church was too far. Some were secret, made by lovers forbidden by law or status, and some were undone, because hand-fasting in its earliest forms could be broken. If after a year and a day the couple found themselves unhappy, if no love bloomed, if no child was conceived, or if hardship proved too great, they could part. The bond untied, the ribbon returned, the hands released. It wasn't scandalous, not in every village, not when the ritual was still sacred in its own way. But by the later Middle Ages, things began to change. The church grew louder. Bishops declared that only unions made before clergy were real. Hand-fastings were called sinful, dangerous, temptations wrapped in old custom. Yet the people remembered, and even nobles in secret sometimes performed hand-fastings before their official wedding, to prove to one another their private devotion before the public spectacle, a whispered promise before the trumpet call. Think of them, a young knight and his bride, to be in a candlelit hallway the night before their wedding. No witnesses, just them, and a bit of red silk, tied between their fingers as they whisper not vows, but truths. I will love you. I will walk beside you. I will protect your name as my own. And then the silk tucked away beneath a pillow, a secret kept forever. There were others, those who used hand-fasting not for love, but for advantage. Tricky suitors would claim a girl had agreed to marry them by taking her hand in a moment of foolishness. And so laws began to intervene. Witnesses were required, records kept. The church demanded bans, formal announcements read aloud, and any union without them was suspect. Still, the image lingered, the red cord, the trembling hands, the silence that settled around two people making a vow not to their priest, but to each other. And the word remains with us, even now, to fasten hands, to promise. Think of how many times you've seen it, even today. In modern weddings, when couples tie cords around their joined hands, they may not know where it comes from, but the motion, the meaning, it endures. Not everything old fades. And so now, as the candlelight of your thoughts begins to flicker lower, you may find yourself imagining those ancient lovers, not kings and queens, but simple folk, farmers, shepherds, bakers and woodcutters, their palms touching, their eyes wide, their hopes as small and as vast as stars. They had no diamonds, no photographers, no guest lists, but they had string, and they had hearts, so if you listen closely, very closely, you may still hear it. The rustle of ribbon, the murmur of vows, the breath of a promise softly spoken into the air. And somewhere in the deep recesses of time, two hands are still tied. Not by law, not by fear, but by choice, the most ancient, the most tender kind. Sleep now. Let your thoughts drift through the trees. Let the cord wrap gently around your dreams. You are safe. You are held. You are handfast until the morning comes. A church wedding, if you could afford it from fields to cathedrals, marriage happened anywhere. You might imagine the medieval wedding as always taking place in a grand cathedral high, arched ceilings, stained glass glinting in the morning sun, monks singing softly in the cloisters, and noblemen in fur-lined tunics gazing solemnly at a bride veiled in silk. And yes, sometimes it did look just like that. Sometimes it was all glory and grandeur. But far more often, weddings in the medieval world looked much different, much quieter, much simpler, much closer to the ground, and if you listen quietly now, you'll hear it. Not the echo of choirs or golden bells, but the rustle of leaves, the murmur of neighbors, the slow crunch of boots on packed dirt, and somewhere, faintly, the voice of a priest humble, perhaps uncertain, offering a blessing beneath a sky that has no ceiling but clouds, because marriage in the medieval world, for all its deep spiritual weight, was not always about the church. It was first and foremost about union, two families joining, two households intertwining, two names, or sometimes two fields, becoming one. The church played a growing role, of course. Especially by the 12th century onward, marriage was more and more viewed as a sacrament, a holy bond before God, but that didn't mean it had to take place inside the walls of a church. In fact, for centuries, the preferred location for a wedding, yes, even a church, sanctioned one, was just outside its doors, on the church steps, not in velvet pews or candle-lit chapels, but right there beneath the open sky, between the sacred building and the public road, between the holy and the human. The priest would stand with the couple before the entrance, their hands perhaps clasped, perhaps not. The community would gather, neighbors, kin, friends from the market, and there vows would be spoken, loudly, clearly, because what mattered most in many parts of medieval Europe was public consent. You had to say it. You had to mean it, and people had to hear it, not just whispers in private, not just secret meetings under moonlight, but loud and clear before witnesses. I take thee as mine. I give myself to thee. And then, sometimes, only sometimes, the ceremony might move inside, if there was time, if there was coin, if the couple could afford the extra pomp. But for many, that threshold, those cold, weathered stone steps, were holy enough. Still, a church wedding was desirable, aspirational, something to hope for, especially as time went on and the church tightened its grip on what counted as proper marriage. By the later Middle Ages, bishops and clerics began insisting that all marriages should be done before a priest. And not just any priest, but one from your own parish. The rules became stricter. The bans, the public announcements of the upcoming marriage, had to be read aloud 3 Sundays in a row. No skipping, no surprises. It became harder to marry quietly, but not impossible, especially for peasants. For them, marriage was still something done within reach. It had to be. Imagine 2 young villagers. She a shepherd's daughter, he a miller's apprentice. They have no money for finery, no golden rings, no dowries to speak of. Just a hope to build a life together. They've waited through the winter. They've helped with the lambing, tended the grain, and now, in spring, they approach the priest. He's tired, he's overworked. He lives humbly in the rectory near the fields, but he agrees, and so they wed. Perhaps beneath a wooden arch woven with local flowers. Perhaps in the village green before the whole community. Or yes, perhaps on the very doorstep of the parish church, the stone warm from the midday sun. There might be bread broken afterward. Ale poured, a fiddle played, but there would be no feast of gold. No procession of nobles, just joy. Just relief, just promise. And what if you were noble? What if you were born into land and title and silk-lined sleeves? Then your wedding might indeed look like the dream. A grand cathedral, say, York Minster or Canterbury or Notre Dame in its earliest days, towering above. The bride in imported fabrics, the groom in a velvet mantle. Latin chants echoing through the apse. Dozens of guests, tables piled high with honeyed pears and roasted boar, trumpets at the door, but such weddings were rare. Expensive, political. Often the bride and groom barely knew one another. Often they were too young to even speak their own vows. A bishop might speak for them. A parent might nod in their place, and beneath all the gold and grandeur, Narcissist there was Simsplynel caught I in. So ask yourself, what truly made the wedding sacred? The place, the wealth, the wine? Or was it simply the act itself, 2 people, bound not by cathedral ceilings, but by consent and hope? Even for the church there was confusion. For many centuries, no single rulebook guided all weddings. Different regions followed different rites. In some places, rings were required, in others not. Some priests expected the couple to kneel. Others had them stand. Some insisted on Latin, others allowed the common tongue. It was a patchwork. A patchwork of humanity? And in the most remote places in the misty hills of Wales, the green pastures of Devonshire, the stone villages of Brittany, weddings often had to happen quickly, simply, quietly. There might be no altar, no organ, no carved oak pews. Only a priest, only 2 hands, and perhaps the bell of the church, rung softly to let the village know a union had begun. Sometimes weddings happened in secret, if the families disapproved, if one of the couple was promised elsewhere, if the lovers were mismatched in wealth or station. And yet the vows could still be made, still be binding. The church would later try to annul these unions, to scold or punish or excommunicate. But love, as always, had a way of slipping past rules. And so the church wedding, this grand thing, was never just one thing. It could be a spectacle in a cathedral, or a whisper on a roadside. It could be sanctioned with the blessing of bishops, or carried out beneath a sky of clouds, with only a passing priest and a few friends as witness. And wherever it happened, it was sacred, because in the medieval heart, the moment of union, the joining of lives, was the true altar. The true cathedral was the space between 2 people, the nave their promise, the choir their silence, the sanctuary the life they would build. And now, as you rest, as your breath slows with the rhythm of the past, you may begin to imagine these weddings scattered like pearls across the tapestry of time. A wedding in a meadow with daisies woven into the bride's hair. A wedding before sunrise, the dew still clinging to the grass. A wedding in the shadow of stone, with candles flickering softly in the dusk, no two alike, each one sacred, not because of grandeur, but because of choice, because in a world filled with toil and silence and suffering, a wedding, no matter how small, no matter where, was a moment of light, a turning, a vow. So let your mind wander now, float gently among the churches, the cottages, the crossroads. Hear the ancient vows spoken again and again in forgotten tongues, forgotten fields. Let them wash over you. Let them lull you. And if sleep begins to wrap around you like a velvet cloak, know that you are resting in the arms of something old and warm and deeply human. Because love, you see, does not require a cathedral, only two hearts and a place to stand. The bridal attire no white gowns, just wealth in fabric and fortune. Let your eyes grow heavy now as we open the wardrobe of a time before diamonds sparkled under electric light, before white became the color of bridal purity, and before dresses were worn just once and never again. Let us return to a world where cloth itself was a currency, where a dress could mean the difference between a good match and a fading future, where what a bride wore said everything about her wealth, her family, her station, her future. Because in the Middle Ages there was no one look for a bride, no satin uniform, no smoke-colored lace gliding down the aisle. There were no boutiques, no designer names, and certainly no Pinterest boards. Instead, the dress a bride wore to her wedding was the finest piece of clothing she had, or if her family could afford it, the finest garment ever made for her hand, stitched, layered, beaded, and belted with the slow, careful work of many hands, not because it was only for the wedding day, but because it might need to last a lifetime. There were no wasteful fashions in most medieval homes. A wedding dress was not a costume. It was a statement, a gift, a practical inheritance. It could be worn again at feast days, on holy days, or handed down through generations. So, imagine it a simple stone house on the edge of a village. The hearth glows low, the morning is young, dew still fresh on the grass, and inside a young woman stands patiently as her mother fastens the sleeves of her best tunic. Perhaps it is dyed a soft earthy green, a color pulled from herbs and bark. Maybe there are tiny embroidered vines at the edges of the cuffs, done carefully over long winter evenings. It is not white, but it is beautiful, and it is hers. Now step further into the castle halls. There, among the nobility, bridal attire begins to shift from the practical to the performative. Wealth meant color, wealth meant fabric, and above all, wealth meant layers. A noble bride might wear a a long gown with a high waist and streaming sleeves, each one trailing like ribbons of silk behind her, or a houppelande, heavy with brocade, stiff with gold thread, and trimmed in fur. These were not dresses made for movement. They were made for showing, meant to be seen, admired, spoken of in whispers by guests who came from lands far beyond the manor walls. And the colors, oh, the colors! The deeper the hue, the deeper the pockets. Royal blue, extracted from lapis lazuli, imported from lands across deserts and seas. Crimson, born from crushed insects and guarded recipes. Gold, gleaming from gilded thread that caught the candlelight with every breath. To wear such colors was to wear a fortune, literally, and yet there was no white, not yet. White in the medieval mind was not the bridal color. It was a color of purity, yes, but also of mourning, of spiritual surrender. Monks wore white. The dead were wrapped in white. But brides, they wore their wealth, because in this world marriage was an alliance, a contract, a chess move. And when a bride stood at her wedding, she was not only herself. She was the visible proof of her family's prosperity, her father's negotiations, her mother's sewing skills. Every bead was a statement, every stitch a symbol, and there were other meanings too, hidden meanings, silent signals. A belt of silver might mean she came with land. A veil trimmed in pearls might hint at her mother's noble birth. And a ring, if it gleamed at all, meant her groom had deep coffers indeed. But even among the wealthy, the attire of a bride was not always new. Garments were expensive. Fabric was precious. A fine wool tunic could be passed down, altered, repurposed. Heirloom pieces carried memory and legacy, sewn not only with thread, but with the names and lives of women long gone. And among the poor their bridal attire may seem humble by modern eyes, but it too was rich, not in jewels but in care. Imagine a girl from a farming family. Her dress might be wool, carefully spun, dyed with nettle or onion skin, stitched with hands that had milked cows and tilled fields, now working gently to give her something lovely to wear as she stood before her community. The pride in such a garment cannot be measured by coin. And what of veils? In the medieval world, veils were worn by many women, not just brides. They were signs of modesty, of social grace, of religious observance. But on a wedding day, a bride's veil might be special, heavier, finer, longer. For some, it symbolized transition, covering the maiden, revealing the wife. In certain regions, brides wore circlets, simple crowns of flowers or delicate metalwork. In others, especially among royalty, golden coronets were placed atop carefully braided hair. These were not merely decorative. They reminded everyone present this was not just a union of two people. It was a ceremony of inheritance, of names and legacies, of power being transferred from one house to another. Hair itself held symbolism. In many traditions, unmarried women wore their hair down, loosened, long, and unbound. Once married, a woman might always keep her hair hidden or contained in braids and veils. So the wedding day was often the last time a woman would appear before others with her hair flowing freely. One final moment of girlhood before stepping into a wife's role. And what of shoes? For most peasants, feet met the earth more often than not. But on a wedding day, even the humblest bride would try to wear her best. Soft leather shoes, if possible, perhaps gifted by a godparent or passed down from an older sister. Nobles, on the other hand, might wear shoes carved from wood, padded with cloth, or even tipped in silver or adorned with gemstones. They were more for show than comfort. Everything about bridal attire in this age served a purpose beyond fashion. It told a story, not of fleeting style, but of permanence, of place, of family, of value, and after the wedding, the dress did not vanish into a box. It lived on, worn again, perhaps during the christening of a child, or at Easter, or on the feast day of the saint the bride was named after. Over time, it might be altered, cut to fit a growing belly, or stitched tighter after a long illness. Pieces of it might become part of a younger sister's gown, or sewn into a burial shroud when the time came to return to the earth. Clothes were not disposable. They were sacred even in their mundanity, and still, even amid the grandeur and gravity, there was room for joy. There are glimpses, here and there, in letters and illustrations, of brides laughing in richly colored tunics, of girls decorating each other's sleeves with ribbons the night before the wedding, of soft blushes when the groom first glimpsed her in her wedding garb, especially if they'd never met before, especially if he'd expected less or more. The beauty of medieval bridal attire lies not in its conformity, but its diversity. No two brides looked the same, no single gown became the template. Each one was shaped by geography, class, trade, religion, season, family, and fortune. And even as you drift now, slowly, softly towards sleep, imagine them. Brides walking across grassy fields in crimson robes. Brides with rosemary tucked behind one ear, said to bring fertility. Brides in wool cloaks in winter, with white furs stitched at the neck. Brides barefoot beneath their long hems, feeling the earth's pulse. Brides too young to understand the weight of their garments. Brides too old to care. Brides laughing. Brides crying. Brides stitching ribbons into each other's hair. Some proud, some nervous, some hopeful, all dressed in the fabric of their moment, stitched not by trend, but by truth. So, as your breath slows and your body softens beneath your blankets, let yourself imagine those dresses, layered hand, sewn heavy with time, Let their quiet elegance wrap around your thoughts. Let the texture of linen, the shimmer of silk, the whisper of wool lull you. Let the medieval world tuck you in, not with cold stone or sharp swords, but with garments made by candlelight, with care, and worn by women stepping into something entirely unknown. And now, gently as you fade into sleep, remember, there was never just one wedding dress. There was only her best dress. Worn with pride, worn with hope, worn to begin again. Symbolism of the veil, modesty, mystery, and societal expectations. Let the world around you fall away now, gently, quietly. The hum of modern things can rest phones, lights, thoughts. For tonight, we drift backward not to battlefields or throne rooms, but into something softer, a whisper, a covering, a symbol carried by brides for centuries, the medieval veil. It seems so delicate, doesn't it? A slip of cloth, sheer and weightless. But in the medieval world, this fragile thing held meaning far heavier than its threads. It was not simply an accessory. It was a marker, a ritual, a layered message. The veil spoke, even when the bride did not. Picture her. She stands still in the early morning, somewhere in the 12th or 13th century. Her eyes are calm but distant. Around her, older women prepare her quietly, gently. A mother, perhaps an aunt. Her hair, brushed and plaited with care, is then hidden beneath the veil. And once it's placed, she is no longer a maiden in the eyes of the world. She is becoming a wife. The veil, you see, wasn't merely decoration. It was transformation. In many parts of medieval Europe, the veil functioned as a veil in the truest sense of the word. To conceal, to shelter, to protect. It often covered the hair, sometimes the face, sometimes the shoulders. The way it was worn changed from region to region, era to era, but the meaning remained relatively steady. Modesty, humility, readiness in early Christianity, and thus in medieval Christian societies, hair was viewed as powerful, even dangerous. For a woman to let her hair flow freely was considered a sign of youthful innocence or seductive recklessness. Brides, therefore, would veil themselves not only to show respect for God and the sacrament of marriage, but to symbolize their passage from one kind of life into another. The veil was privacy, the veil was surrender, the veil was change, it wasn't white. That color would only come centuries later, after Queen Victoria made it fashionable. In the medieval age, veils came in many shades: ivory, beige, pale pink, soft blue, and even golden hues. They were usually made from linen or fine wool for the peasantry, and from silk or gauze for noble women. The richer the bride, the lighter the fabric, and the longer the veil. Long veils were not merely elegant. They were dramatic. Practicality mattered little on a wedding day. A noble bride might trail a veil for yards behind her, held aloft by handmaidens, or fluttering through the air like a banner. And like a banner, it proclaimed her family's wealth, her father's power, and the importance of the marriage alliance. Sometimes the veil was embroidered, decorated with symbols, prayers, or even family crests. Imagine golden thread tracing out vines or tiny crosses. Picture pearls sewn along the edges, catching the light as she moved. Each stitch, each detail was meaningful. It told the world this was no ordinary day. This was no ordinary girl. In peasant communities, where the materials were plainer, the veil still held sacred importance. It might be passed down from mother to daughter, from sister to sister, stored carefully in a chest with lavender and rosemary. The act of placing the veil upon the bride's head was a small ceremony all its own, often done before the church bells rang, before the priest's voice echoed. Quiet and deeply intimate, but veils were not just spiritual symbols. They were social ones, too. To be veiled was to be claimed, protected, spoken for. A married woman wore her veil differently than an unmarried one. In many towns, a woman going unveiled after her wedding was seen as shameless, even scandalous. A widow might cast hers off, reclaiming her independence. A bride, however, wore hers proudly, softly, like a new skin. There were legal implications, too. In some cases, the act of unveiling or removing the veil was used to mark certain marital transitions. In parts of medieval Germany, for instance, the lifting of the bride's veil by her husband could be symbolic of the consummation to come, a public act that mirrored a private rite. Sometimes the priest lifted it himself, revealing the bride's face just before the vows were spoken, as if to confirm her identity. This is the woman, yes, this is she. And oh, the poetry of that moment, her face, hidden just moments before, now visible to all, a kind of blooming, a gentle unveiling like the first bud of spring after a long frost. The community sees her, the groom sees her, and she, perhaps for the first time, sees herself not as a daughter, but as a wife. Yet not all veils were soft and sentimental. In royal circles, veils could be armor. They guarded the bride's face from scrutiny, shielding her from judgment. Remember, many medieval marriages were arranged. Often the bride and groom had never met. The veil added drama, suspense, it obscured blemishes, it cloaked youth or age, and in a few heartbreaking tales it hid fear. There are stories whispered in old chronicles of brides too young to know the meaning of the veil, too afraid to walk alone into a foreign court, of women veiled so heavily they stumbled under the weight, of queens to be, cloaked and bound in stiff ceremonial robes, paraded before strange faces in strange lands, carrying entire dynasties in their small gloved hands. And yet even in these weighty moments the veil served her. It offered her a shield, a curtain between her thoughts and the world. It's easy to forget, now, how much power silence once held. The medieval bride was expected to be quiet. Composed, graceful, the veil emphasized this. It muted, it muffled, it softened her voice, her steps, her features. She became, in a way, a symbol herself, like a statue of the Virgin Mary, draped in sacred cloth. Holy, untouchable, and this sanctity lingered even after the vows. For many women, the wedding veil was just the beginning of a lifetime of veiling. Married women covered their heads in most public settings. It was not only custom, it was expectation. Hair, once the pride of girlhood, became private. The veil, then, was not merely ceremonial. It marked a permanent shift in visibility. To be married was to become less seen in some ways, but more visible in others. And what of the moments when the veil was removed? Ah, here is where meaning deepens. In some traditions, the veil was removed by the groom on the wedding night, a slow and solemn moment, full of anticipation and nervous quiet. In other places it was burned or buried, symbolizing the end of maidenhood. In a few rural customs, it was given to the church as an offering hung near the altar or used to wrap relics, a reminder that marriage was not only a social contract, but a sacred one. But perhaps the most tender use of the veil was in death. Many women were buried in the same veil they wore on their wedding day, faded by time, yes, threadbare, perhaps, but wrapped carefully around their heads one final time, like a circle completed. Life had begun in cloth, and now ended in it. There's something gentle in that, isn't there? The idea that a single piece of fabric could accompany you through every threshold, from maiden to wife to mother to ancestor, that it held your memories in its folds, that it was both the covering and the comfort. And so, as you lay there now, warm beneath your own layers, safe in your quiet room, think of those veils. Think of the women who wore them. Not all of them were queens or noble ladies. Many were girls with chapped hands and crooked teeth, holding in their breath as the veil was pinned down. Some wept behind it, some smiled, some trembled. All of them stepped forward into something unknown. The veil did not speak for them, but it said enough. It said, I am ready, I am protected, I am seen and unseen. I am beginning, and now so are you. Not a wedding, perhaps, but a passage of your own, a journey into rest, into silence, into dreams shaped like distant towers, old songs and women in silk. Let your mind drift. Let the threads wrap around you. Let the veil fall gently across your thoughts, and sleep beneath its quiet protection. The groom's journey, sometimes drunk, sometimes armed, often very young. In the hush of morning mist, where fields are still damp with dew, and hearths have only just begun to glow with their first fires, the groom rises. Not always by choice. Sometimes he is shaken awake by the boisterous laughter of his companions, his brothers, his uncles, the stable boys from the manor yard. Sometimes it's a priest who gently taps his shoulder, or a steward reminding him that the feast must begin soon, and there are shoes yet to be polished, and a tunic yet to be pulled over his thin frame, because sometimes the groom is still a boy, and in the medieval world that is often where the journey begins. Marriage, for men in medieval society, did not always wait for maturity. Among the nobility, young men could be promised as husbands long before their voices had deepened, their armor fit, or their swords had ever drawn blood. Sometimes a groom was only 12, 14, 16, a squire on the edge of knighthood, a name inked into a treaty before the ink had dried on his schooling. This boy, still drowsy, might look out the small window and see the village square dressed in ribbons. Or perhaps he rides to the cathedral beneath a grey sky, flanked by banners bearing his family's crest. There may be no joy in his eyes, or perhaps there's a nervous flicker of excitement because he has never seen his bride, because he has never known what love might look like, because he is stepping into the unknown. And oh, how strange that step can be, because for some grooms the journey to marriage is not a simple procession. It is a gauntlet of customs, challenges, and often mischief. There were regions where grooms were paraded through their village before the ceremony, not as a celebration, but as a rite of passage. Painted faces, jests from friends, ale spilled down the front of their tunic. It was meant to humble him, to prepare him, to remind him that while marriage was sacred, it was also very, very human. In certain towns, the groom would undergo a ritual shave, the removal of boyhood, in a sense, a symbolic grooming for the man he was about to become. His father might oversee it, or a close male friend, and there would be laughter, of course, teasing, jokes about what lay ahead that night, because in the medieval imagination the wedding night loomed large. And that brings us to the ale. Oh, yes, the ale. It was not unusual for grooms, particularly among the lower classes, to be thoroughly drunk before the ceremony even began. It was tradition in some areas for the groom's family to host a wedding wake the night before, a lively, often chaotic event full of song, drink, and storytelling. A final celebration of bachelorhood. The groom might stumble into his vows the next day with a pounding head and wine-stained sleeves. But drunkenness was not always frivolous. Sometimes it masked fear. To marry was to commit, to a household, to a lineage, to a lifetime of provision. In a world where mortality hovered near every doorway and the burdens of manhood came early, the groom shouldered expectations like armor. And sometimes, like armor, they were heavy. The drink numbed the edges. Other times, the groom wore real armor. In more tumultuous regions, or among noble families with bitter rivals, the groom might attend his own wedding wearing a sword, not as a flourish but as a safeguard. There are recorded instances of weddings interrupted by feuding families where swords were drawn not in celebration but in violence. Love and politics were never far apart. Imagine him, then, standing at the altar, his sword at his hip. Behind him his father, his uncle, perhaps his liege lord, their eyes heavy with expectation. His bride approaches. He does not smile, not because he is unkind, but because this is not a moment for softness. It is a transaction. An alliance. The stakes are written in land, dowries, and names. And yet not every groom was so stoic. There are sweet tales, too, of nervous hands fumbling with rings, of grooms whispering something gentle beneath their breath as the bride arrived, of young men brushing their tunic one more time, smoothing their hair in the reflection of a well bucket, hoping, perhaps, that she might find them pleasing, hoping that this marriage, arranged as it might be, could hold the seeds of affection. In the peasant class, the groom's journey was different, often less ceremonial, but no less emotional. A farm boy might propose in the most practical way after harvest, after the hay was stored, once the sheep were pinned. "We should marry before winter," he might say, chewing on a stalk of barley, and she would nod, and they would make plans. He would trade chickens or tools for her hand, offer labor to her father, or promise a small plot of land. The wedding might take place on a Sunday after Mass outside the church doors. No priest needed just witnesses, but still he would wear his best shirt, wash with soap, comb his hair with fingers, and when he saw her walking up the road, in her ribboned kerchief and stitched shawl, he would smile in a way that was neither political nor practiced. It would be true. In some traditions, the groom was expected to prove himself before marriage. There are tales half, legend half, fact of young men who had to fight for their bride. In tournaments, in duels, in contests of strength or song. One ballad from the Highlands tells of a groom who had to recite 3 verses, plough a field in a single morning, and win a wrestling match before he could claim his bride. It wasn't law. It was love cloaked in custom. There were also playful rituals. Some grooms were kidnapped by their own friends and held ransom for a cask of wine before being released to the ceremony. Others were dressed in women's clothing as a jest, then stripped of it at the altar, symbolically shedding their old life. These were moments of laughter, of transformation, of nervous boys becoming husbands before a crowd. And all of it, every path, led to one moment, the vows. Imagine the groom standing in the doorway of a small stone church, birds singing outside, wind rustling the thatch, the priest's voice rising slowly in Latin, his bride beside him. A hush falls, he takes her hand, maybe for the first time. His palm is calloused, or soft, or trembling, and he speaks the words, some ancient, some new, words that have been spoken by thousands before him, in fields, in castles, in candlelit chapels. And in that moment, something changes. He is no longer a son, no longer just a farmer, or a squire, or a merchant's apprentice. He is a husband. He will share his bed, his bread, his name, and later, much later, he will sit by a fire with grey in his beard and lines by his eyes. He will watch his children chase chickens through the yard, or argue over apples, and he will think back to that morning, that hour when the dew was fresh and the world felt wide, and he will remember the weight of her hand in his, the trembling of his own voice, and he will know that was the moment everything began. So now, as your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts slow, think of the grooms of old, some drunk, some armed, some barely more than boys, but all of them walking toward something unknown, toward vows, toward partnership, toward the slow, unfolding mystery of marriage, and let their journeys lull you. Let the sound of their footsteps echo gently in your mind, because the road to love, no matter how ancient, is never straight. It curves, it climbs, it carries, and you are safe to sleep within its story. Witnesses and consent, the noisy crowd that made it legal. It might seem strange to us now, in this quiet hour, to imagine a wedding not marked by the delicate ring of string quartets, or gentle vows spoken beneath soft chandeliers. No hush of reverence, no whispered anticipation as a veil is drawn. No, in medieval times, marriage, while often sacred, was also undeniably loud. It was messy, public, cluttered with chatter and ceremony and opinion, because in that distant world of crumbling stone chapels and muddy village roads, a marriage wasn't just a personal promise between two hearts, it was a social contract. One forged not in secrecy, but in the full view of community, family, clergy, and neighbors. And the witnesses, oh, the witnesses were everything. From the very first stirrings of courtship, a couple was rarely alone. Their intentions, their futures, their suitability for one another, these were matters of broad discussion. Mothers and fathers spoke in quiet corners, lords made inquiries, parishioners gossiped by the well. Friends exchanged glances across the table. The village itself, sometimes the entire manor, began to lean in. Was it true? Were they truly going to wed? And if they were, who would bear witness? In our modern world, we might choose a best man, a maid of honor. Perhaps a select few invited guests, seated politely in pews. But in the medieval world, the audience for a wedding was often the entire world that surrounded the couple. They came by foot, by cart, from farms and fields. Neighbors in woolen cloaks, chimney sweeps and shepherds, fishmongers and knights. Some came for the spectacle, others out of obligation, and many came simply because a wedding, any wedding, was a rare and beautiful break in the rhythm of daily toil, and their presence mattered more than sentiment, because in the eyes of both church and society, the witnesses were the proof. Their eyes were the record, their memories the scroll. It was their noise, their presence, their confirming nods that made a marriage lawful. You see, in many medieval regions, particularly in the earlier centuries, a couple could marry without a priest at all, so long as the vows were spoken aloud, exchanged freely, and heard by others. It was called verba de presenti, words spoken in the present tense, words like "I take you as mine," and "I will love and keep you." And if enough ears heard those words, if enough people bore witness to their exchange, the marriage was considered binding. Imagine that now, a young couple perhaps standing just outside the church after Mass, fingers nervously entwined, eyes darting shyly to one another. He turns, clears his throat, and says it his vow. She answers softly, and around them the crowd hushes. Heads tilt, someone leans in, a child giggles, an elder murmurs, "So it's done, then." That was all it took. No rings, no incense, no procession, just the consent, spoken freely, and the presence of witnesses. But oh, how delicate that balance could be, because consent, while sacred, was not always given freely, especially for brides. Young women, particularly those of noble birth, could find themselves caught in the tides of family arrangements and political strategy. A marriage might be decided without their voice, a dowry negotiated, a land parcel agreed upon. And yet, even within those constraints, the Church insisted, at least in theory, that the bride must consent. So on the day of the wedding, in front of the witnesses, she would be asked, "Do you take this man?" And if she did not answer, if she hesitated, if she cried out or turned away, the witnesses would remember. Some would say nothing. Others would whisper, but one or two might speak up later. Should a dispute arise, she said no. They might murmur, or her father forced her, or I saw her shake her head. That is why they were there, not just to cheer or to feast, but to see the truth. And to hold it, because medieval marriages could be challenged, and often were. In certain legal cases, marriages were later declared invalid based on what the witnesses recalled. Perhaps the groom had another wife, one the bride never knew about. Perhaps the bride had been too young to give lawful consent. Or perhaps, in a moment of drunken courage, the couple had pledged themselves to one another in a field by moonlight, with only a passing shepherd to bear witness, and then forgot it the next day. But the shepherd did not forget, and he could be called upon. Yes, he might say, "I heard them, I was there, I saw their hands joined." It was enough. In some places, even a single witness could determine the outcome of a marriage dispute. That's why people wanted to be there. Not just to see the kiss, but to be a part of it all, a legal chorus, a living memory, and so the weddings were loud. The vows were spoken with clear voices, not whispered, not secret, not tucked away. The crowd gathered close, pressing in, nodding, confirming. Candles flickered in their breath, garlands rustled in the breeze, someone sneezed, someone gasped. Someone said they've done it, and once they had, the witnesses stayed because their job wasn't over yet. They watched the procession, they watched the feast, and in some cases they even followed the couple to the bedchamber. Yes, the bedding ceremony, a deeply awkward, often theatrical ritual, where the bride and groom were led, sometimes stripped, sometimes mocked, sometimes blessed, into their marital bed. The idea was that their union must not only be witnessed by word, but by act, not always literally. Sometimes it was symbolic, a shoe thrown at the door, a sock tugged off, a curtain drawn, while laughter echoed through the halls. But always someone watched, not for scandal, but for record, so that tomorrow and next year and in 20 years no one could say they weren't truly married. Because someone would answer, I was there, I saw, I remember. The very walls of medieval communities were woven with memory. And yet, with all of this noise, with the chatter, the chants, the clapping, what truly mattered always was consent. Not the kind we know today, perhaps, not always fair, not always pure, but consent that was heard, because the witnesses, whether noble knights or barefoot peasants, were not there for decoration. They were the silent scribes of the heart, the informal court, the breathing parchment. It was through them that marriages became fact. And when the feast had ended, and the candles had burned down to wax puddles, and the guests returned to their farms and fields, it was those witnesses who carried the marriage into the world. They would speak of it to others. She wore blue. They might say, he looked frightened. They looked happy. And in these memories, quiet, communal, unrecorded, the marriage would live on. So now, as your breath slows and your thoughts drift, imagine those ancient crowds, the flicker of firelight on their faces, the clatter of cups, the scent of bread and earth and old wool, a baby crying somewhere in the distance, the soft murmur of old women gossiping beside the doorway, and at the center of it all, 2 hands joined, and dozens of eyes watching, and a silence falling just long enough to hear the most ancient words, I take thee, and thus, in the noise and the stillness alike, history was made. And now you may sleep, wrapped not in silk, but in centuries of memory, safe beneath the watchful eyes of those who once stood witness, always watching, always remembering, always there, the wedding feast days of meat, ale, and singing in muddy boots. The vows were spoken. The crowd had cheered. A pair of hands, once trembling, had been joined before the world. But in the medieval mind, the ceremony itself, the exchange of consent, however sacred or legal, was just the beginning. It was not the final exclamation of the day, but rather the prelude, the soft opening before the real event unfolded. Because after the words were said and the union declared, something grand, unruly, and heartily anticipated came next. The feast in the medieval world, a wedding feast, was more than a meal. It was a declaration, a living proof of wealth, of generosity, of status. But it was also, quite simply, a long-awaited excuse to put down one's tools, forget about debts and duties, and surrender to celebration. Imagine, for a moment, the setting. We are not always in a stone castle or manor hall, though we might be. More often we are in a timbered great house, a barn cleared of hay, or a large tent stitched together from canvas and dreams. The table might be nothing more than planks laid across barrels, the chairs, uneven stools or upturned crates, the floor earthen, the air a wild mixture of firewood smoke, roasted meat, crushed herbs, and the sweet tang of spilled ale. The bride and groom sit at the high table, flanked by family, with a long view of their guests below. These guests are not just blood relatives. They are shepherds and cousins, bakers and bondmen, wet nurses and retainers. In the glow of the feast, the hierarchy softens just a little. For a day or two, everyone shares in the same story. They were at the wedding. And so the food begins to arrive. Not one dish, not even 2, but dozens, perhaps, courses served in waves, like tides rolling in from a kitchen stoked with sweat and wood smoke. In the halls of the noble, one might see trenchers flat, thick slices of stale bread, used as edible plates, laden with stewed venison, roasted swan, or a pie stuffed with fish, eggs, and spices. Servants, barefoot or hurried, dart in and out with pitchers of mead and jugs of wine. A suckling pig might be brought in whole, its mouth stuffed with apples, poultry dyed with saffron, hams glazed in honey, eel pies, frumenti, boiled wheat seasoned with almond milk and spiced raisins. In more modest settings, the fare is simpler, but no less heartfelt. Stews of cabbage and leeks, oaten bread, still warm from the morning's fire, wheels of hard cheese, bowls of barley pottage. Maybe, if fortune has smiled on the family, a joint of pork or a goose shared by all. There are no forks, only knives, spoons, and fingers. The guests eat elbow to elbow, shoulder to shoulder. Conversation flows like ale. People shout across tables. Children chase one another beneath the benches. Dogs whine for scraps. Somewhere in the background, a lute is plucked lazily. A gurdy moans a wandering tune. A drum keeps time with the rising rhythm of the night. And always the ale. It pours endlessly. Brewed by the women of the village, bitter and warm, it is drunk from wooden cups, leather tankards, or shared directly from the pitcher. It makes the shy bold, the old cheerful, the serious foolish. Toasts ring out for the bride, the groom, the parents, the priest, the chickens, anyone and anything that deserves a moment's praise. To the bride, to the new land they'll farm, to the saint who held back the rain today, to love, to lust, the air grows thick with cheer. And then, after the food, the revelry deepens. Out come the musicians. Not professionals, but locals, those who know the old songs by heart, who tap rhythms with their heels and shake tambourines with elbows dusted in flour. They play tunes that their fathers knew and their grandmothers before them. Songs with verses that go on for minutes, choruses shouted rather than sung. Dancing begins, not the elegant, choreographed dances of court, but the stomping, circling hand, clapping jigs of the fields. Feet slap the floor, boots grow muddy, skirts whirl, hair loosens, breath shortens. The air is loud with laughter. Sometimes guests form a circle around the bride and groom. They are urged to dance, teased into it. The couple may blush, pretend reluctance, then join in with hesitant steps. They spin, hand in hand, until dizziness and delight become indistinguishable. And still the feast is not done, because now come the entertainments. In a noble household, this may mean jesters with painted faces, tumblers who throw themselves into impossible shapes, or storytellers with voices thick as honey. In the countryside, it may be old Tom from the mill reciting bawdy tales, or Elsie the midwife singing a haunting ballad of a drowned knight and a weeping willow. There may be games of dice, of riddles, of strength. Someone juggles apples. Someone else pretends to be the bishop, declaring comically inaccurate blessings. A boy with a flute tries to charm a chicken. The crowd roars, but somewhere amid the laughter and rhythm, there is tenderness too. An old woman presses her hand to the bride's cheek and whispers a blessing she learned when she was just a girl. A father sits silently, eyes moist, remembering his own wedding and wondering where the time went. A child falls asleep in a corner, thumb in mouth, oblivious to the chaos. And always someone is singing songs of love, of longing, of the greenwood trees, of knights who returned, of maids who waited, of ships that never came home, melodies that seem to stretch beyond the hall, beyond the forest, beyond even time. And so the night deepens, the candles burn low, their wax pooling on rough wood. The embers in the fire crackle softly, glowing red and sleepy. Guests begin to slip away, some stumbling into the cold night, others curling under cloaks near the hearth. A few still dance half, dreaming now, slow and swaying. The bride has disappeared, the groom too, their absence is not questioned. The union is sealed, the day is won. By morning the hall will be quiet again. The floors will be strewn with crumbs, the tables cleared, the decorations wilting. But the echo will remain, and in the days to come, the feast will be remembered in detail. The pie. Did you taste that pie? I haven't danced like that in years. Did you hear Thomas fall into the trough? I swear, The bride's dress shimmered like morning dew. A proper wedding, that was. And so the feast lives on, not just in bellies, but in memory. A tale told again and again, growing richer with each retelling. A thread woven into the tapestry of the community. Because the medieval wedding feast was not just a party. It was the soul of the celebration, the heartbeat, the laughter that carried the vows forward. It was noisy, muddy, crowded, and deeply, undeniably human. It fed not just the hunger of the body, but the longing for connection. And tonight, as you drift into sleep, perhaps you can still hear the echoes, the clink of tankards, the stomp of muddy boots, the rustle of woolen skirts, the voice of a lute beneath a song about love, and bread, and luck, and time. The sound of a people coming together not just to witness a union, but to sing it into being. Let the echoes carry you now. Let them soften into silence. Let the feast go on, somewhere in a dream forever warm, forever loud, and forever filled with joy. Blessings, superstitions, and saints from holy water to charms against evil eyes. In the flickering shadows of the medieval world, beneath cathedral spires and moss-draped trees, belief held power. A power so potent, so deeply woven into the fabric of daily life, that no wedding, no matter how grand or humble, could proceed without a delicate dance between the sacred and the strange. Blessings and superstitions were not opposing forces. They were sisters, one raised in the light of the church, the other in the whispering woods. And for a bride and groom stepping into the uncertainty of marriage, both were called upon with equal reverence. Before the first note of celebration, before the bread was broken or the wine poured, there was preparation. Not just the lacing of dresses or the sharpening of knives, but the guarding of souls. A wedding, after all, was not simply a union of two people. It was a crossing, a transformation, a moment of exposure when two lives became one, and the veil between blessings and danger seemed perilously thin. The first protection came in the form of prayer. On the morning of her wedding, a bride might rise before the sun and kneel at the edge of her bed, or before a statue of the Virgin, whispering her hopes into the stillness. She might pray for strength, for gentleness, for a husband who would not raise his hand, for many healthy children, for a long life, but that wasn't all. She would also pray for protection, against envy, against illness, against the unseen. A priest might offer a formal blessing, of course holy water sprinkled over the couple, incense trailing like silk in the air, Latin words wrapping them in invisible armor. The ceremony itself, performed within the walls of the church, was considered sacred enough to invite divine favor. Yet for many, the official rites were just one layer of defense. Beneath her gown, a bride might wear a charm hidden in the folds of linen or sewn into the hem, a tiny scrap of parchment inscribed with a saint's name, a knotted cord blessed by a local holy woman, a thimble of salt tied in a pouch meant to ward off curses and ill wishes, because weddings, for all their joy, were dangerously public. People watched, they whispered, and some among them, it was feared, might carry the evil eye. The evil eye, the silent curse delivered by a glare, a thought, a flicker of resentment, was a dread that spanned continents and centuries. It needed no incantation, no ritual, just a look, a feeling. The wrong person witnessing your happiness could bring illness to your future children or coldness to your marriage bed. A barren womb, a sudden fever, a fall from a horse, and so protection was needed. Always, guests, especially older women, might murmur small charms beneath their breath as the bride passed. Fingers traced the shape of the cross. Some would spit, just lightly, 3 times over the bride's shoulder, not out of disrespect, but to drive away spirits who might be lurking near. Others wore pins in their sleeves, or tucked sprigs of rue or rosemary into their clothing, herbs known for centuries to repel evil. Even bells were used not just to mark the moment of vows, but to keep demons at bay. The sound of church bells, it was believed, could send devils running, And if a dog howled outside the church at the moment of the kiss, some might fall silent, eyes wide, fearing a bad omen. But there were saints, too, so many saints. Saints for every need, every wish, every fear. Saint Agnes, virgin and martyr, was often invoked by young women who hoped for a gentle husband. Saint Joseph, the silent carpenter, patron of fathers and marriage. Saint Dwynwen in Wales, patroness of lovers. Saint Raphael the Archangel, a healer and guide for married couples. Their images were etched in lead or carved into wood, worn around necks or hung above beds. Stories of their miracles were passed on from mouth to mouth like lullabies, comforting and ancient. And in the villages, where the saints felt more like neighbors than distant legends, their shrines became part of the marriage ritual. A bride might walk barefoot to the chapel of her favorite saint in the days before her wedding, laying flowers or a lock of her hair at the altar. She might fast for a day, or sleep with a blessed coin under her pillow to ward off bad dreams, and the groom, he too was watched over. His sword, if he had one, might be dipped in holy water. He might carry a stone engraved with a cross in his boot. Some mothers would secretly tie a thread around their son's wrists, red, blue, or black. Nodded 3 times, whispered over, kissed and blessed. And yet, despite all this preparation, the wedding itself was still watched carefully for signs. If it rained, was it a blessing or a curse? If the candle on the altar flickered and went out, who among the guests was hiding ill intent? If a plate fell and shattered during the feast, someone would pause, just for a moment wondering if the marriage would break just as easily. But not all omens were dark. If a spider was seen weaving a web on the bride's gown, it was considered a symbol of fortune, wealth, even. If a cat followed the couple home, it was a sign of fertility. If doves flew over the church, it meant peace would dwell in the home. And laughter? Laughter was the most powerful magic of all. It was said that a wedding full of laughter would echo into the marriage itself. That the louder the guests laughed, the louder the baby would cry strong lungs, strong life. That music played with joy could drive away any sorrow waiting outside the threshold. In some regions, bread was broken over the bride's head, its crumbs caught in her veil. Guests would scramble to collect them, believing that eating these fragments would bring their own good fortune. In others, the groom would carry his new wife across the threshold, not just as a gesture of strength or romance, but to prevent evil spirits from clinging to her souls and entering the home. Every step, every gesture had meaning. The direction the couple faced during the ceremony, the color of the ribbons in the bride's hair, whether the chickens at the feast laid eggs that morning, whether an owl was heard at dusk, whether the fire in the hearth crackled low or high. The medieval world did not separate the spiritual from the practical. To marry was to invite both God and the unknown into your life, and you had to greet them both with offerings. And so, the first night together was also guarded. The bed might be sprinkled with salt. A candle might burn until dawn. A cross might be drawn on the pillow with blessed chalk. A midwife or old aunt might stay in the next room, praying softly until the house fell quiet. If a storm passed over during the night, the wind howling, some would say it was the ancestors, watching, approving, or warning. And when morning came, and the first light touched the window panes, someone would whisper a blessing again. A simple one, may love be the smallest thing you share. Because in truth, it wasn't just about keeping the evil away. It was about inviting the good in. Love, laughter, fertility, partnership, health, rain when it was needed, sun when it wasn't, children with warm eyes and strong bones, a home without hunger, a hand to hold through sickness, a voice beside you at dusk. And so they believed, they prayed, they charmed, they blessed, because to marry in the medieval world was to walk into a future both tender and treacherous. And no one wanted to face it unprotected. Tonight, as your eyes grow heavy and your breath deepens, perhaps you can still feel it. That ancient world beneath your dreams. The flicker of candlelight across stone walls, the scent of rosemary and frankincense, the soft echo of blessings carried on wind. Not loud, not urgent, just steady, quiet, and faithful. May those old words whispered over countless brides and grooms wrap around you too now. May you rest like newlyweds beneath fresh linen, safe, protected, and watched over. The saints are near. The night is kind. Sleep now. The spirits are silent, and all is well. The bedding ceremony, public approval for private beginnings. The wedding was done. The vows had been spoken. The wine poured. The feast, long and sprawling, was beginning to dwindle. Firelight now flickered lower, casting long shadows on the stone walls of the hall. The musicians played slower tunes, and the laughter turned to whispers. Bread crusts and bones lay scattered on the tables. A drunk uncle muttered a story no one listened to. A mother tucked a stray ribbon into her daughter's hair, and somewhere in the corner a candle guttered softly. But the ceremony was not quite over. Not yet, because in the medieval world, to marry was not simply to speak words before witnesses, not merely to seal a contract with kisses and cups. The union wasn't considered truly binding, truly real, until the couple had lain together, until flesh met flesh in a sanctified bed. And so began the final rite, the bedding ceremony. It is, to the modern mind, a strange ritual, but to medieval eyes it was as important as the wedding mass itself. For this was the night the marriage was proven. You might imagine soft music and privacy, but the medieval night offered no such luxury. Instead, it offered tradition, spectacle, and sometimes a room full of clapping, candle-wielding guests. Let us step quietly into one of those rooms now. The bride, perhaps no more than 16, is led from the feast by a procession of women. Her cheeks flushed not only from wine, but from the eyes that followed her. Her fingers gripped the sleeve of her sister or aunt. She is escorted not by her husband, but by ladies and servants and giggling girls. Their footsteps echo down a narrow stone corridor toward the bridal chamber. Along the way, they might stop just briefly, to sing a verse of a traditional wedding song, a teasing one, about love or lust or the swift end of innocence. Her gown, layered, heavy, is untied slowly by many hands. Her hair is brushed, her veil removed. She is bathed, lightly scented, perhaps with lavender or rose water. Her shift is white and soft, and a blessed sprig of rosemary may be tucked beneath her pillow. Meanwhile, the groom is undergoing a ritual of his own. He is not left alone either. His friends and family, his groomsmen and companions, laugh and nudge and toast him again and again. They may remove his boots. They may carry him bodily into the room, if the wine has worked its way deeply enough into his veins. In noble houses, this entire event may be orchestrated with precision. The chamber is lit, the bed is prepared, new linens, fragrant herbs, perhaps a relic or crucifix hanging above. Candles are placed at the four corners. In some regions, even a priest may be present, murmuring blessings as the couple is guided to the bed. Yes, guided, because they would not lie down alone. In front of gathered witnesses, family, clergy, sometimes even members of the court, the couple would be tucked into bed together. The bedding. Now, this did not always mean full nudity or immediate intimacy. In many cases, the bride and groom were allowed to remain in their underclothes. The covering symbolic, the ceremony formal, but they were in the same bed, under the same blanket. The message was clear. The union was to be consummated, and the community stood behind it. At this point, the atmosphere could vary. In some households, the guests lingered just long enough to make merry jokes, to throw coins or flowers onto the bed, or to sing bawdy songs. Suggestive, mischievous, but not cruel. There might be laughter, and wine spilled on the floor. A grandmother might dab her eyes with a lace cloth. A father might look away in silence. Eventually, the guests would file out, one by one, leaving the couple to their privacy. But in other cases, especially among nobility, the the ceremony didn't end there. Sometimes a trusted witness would stay behind, a priest, a midwife, a chamberlain, someone who could later say with certainty that the marriage had been properly sealed, that the two had in fact come together as husband and wife. And in the most formal, high-stakes unions, particularly royal marriages, proof of consummation was demanded. In some medieval courts, the morning after brought another ritual, the display of the bed linens. A blood-stained sheet was shown to the gathered family, servants, or nobility, a grim tradition based on the expectation that the bride was virginal. This was proof, a token of honor, a sign that all had gone as it should. And if the sheet was clean, well, suspicions could begin. Whispers might rise like steam from a pot. Accusations of impotence, deception, witchcraft. In rare and dramatic cases, the validity of the entire marriage could be questioned. But let us return now, not to those courtly extremes, but to a quieter house. Perhaps a cottage on the edge of a village. The wedding feast is long finished, and the bride and groom, wrapped in wool and hope, are curled together in the flickering light of a hearth. No one watches now, no sheets will be inspected, no priests will bless this bed. Instead, there is just the silence of the night, the breath of the wind outside, and the soft creak of wood beneath their bodies. They may not know each other well. They may not even speak the same language fluently. But they are married now, and the bedding ceremony, whether lavish or simple, awkward or joyful, has done its work. It has marked the turning point, the transition. Two individuals have been bound into one household, one fate, one story, witnessed, accepted, but the ritual had deeper meanings too. It was, in a way, a community's investment in the couple's success. To witness the beginning of their union was to say, "We are here. We support this. We will hold you to your vows. We will laugh with you and cry with you, and yes, remind you of your wedding night every time you argue about who forgot to feed the pigs." It was also a moment of powerful vulnerability. Imagine the bride, her hair unbraided, her fingers trembling. The weight of expectations on her small shoulders, the newness of it all, the smells, the feel of another body in the bed, the sudden silence after so much noise, and the groom, perhaps only a boy himself, barely understanding the responsibilities he now carried. The land, the legacy, the protection of his wife, the continuation of his name, they were children, or strangers, or both, and yet they were now husband and wife, and the world around them, through ritual and song, through laughter and prayer, had drawn a circle around them. A boundary, a beginning. In some cultures, traditions lingered even beyond the wedding night. Newlyweds might not sleep alone for weeks, sharing space with siblings or servants to discourage bad spirits. Some households would leave a candle burning for 3 nights. Others would sprinkle salt at the threshold each evening for a fortnight. The bedding was only the start, but it was an important start. It acknowledged that marriage was not just legal, not just religious, but also physical. Intimate, that love, when it came, was to be lived in flesh and breath, in shared blankets and tangled limbs. And so, as you drift tonight into your own dreams, imagine that old world once more. A chamber dimly lit, a bed carved of oak, the smell of beeswax and rosemary, the sound of footsteps fading as the door gently closes. 2 people beneath a shared blanket, hearts beating out of rhythm, but slowly aligning, no cameras. No applause, just a small fire in the hearth, and the quiet promise of something new. Perhaps it was love. Perhaps it was duty. But for that one night, with the village asleep and the stars overhead, it was theirs alone. Sleep now, you've witnessed enough for one night. And in this moment of stillness, may you feel wrapped in as much warmth and wonder as those long ago lovers, beginning their journey by candlelight, under the watchful eyes of their world. And slow, ancient hush of the dark, and now the candles have burned low, the halls have quieted, the songs have ended, the fire is down to its last glowing coals, and the last of the wedding guests have drifted into the night. We've wandered through chapels and cottages, banquet halls and bridal chambers. We've watched as brides were adorned with care, as grooms were toasted with ale, as love and legacy were bound together beneath the soft glow of torchlight. Some unions were born of politics, some of poverty, a few perhaps even born of love. But every medieval wedding was stitched with tradition, with superstition, with expectation, and with hope. Hope that a new household would thrive, that children would come, that land would prosper, that the past could pass, and a new chapter begin. So tonight, as you slip deeper into sleep, let your thoughts drift like flower petals on a breeze. Let them carry you through old stone villages and misty fields. Let your mind wander through tapestries and garlands, dancing shadows and the soft creak of ancient beds. Because though centuries have passed, the ritual remains. We still gather, we still vow, we still believe in the quiet magic of beginnings. Thank you for joining me on this gentle journey. Sleep well, dream warmly, and remember, history is never really gone. It's just waiting in the dark for someone like you to close their eyes and listen. Good night.